Welcome back to another segment. My name is Andrew Mossman, and today we are going to be looking at two parables found in the Revelation, a secret time prophecy, the 6,000-year time prophecy, and also the true midnight cry. We're going to begin with a word of prayer because we're opening up the Bible now. Dear Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We're grateful to be here and to be learning. We need a spirit of wisdom. You've promised to bring us the spirit of truth, to guide us into all truth, and I'd ask that we'd have discernment now. In Jesus' holy name, amen. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. One definition of Antichrist is in the place of Christ. Our first text is going to be Revelation 13, verse 18. It starts off by saying, "Here is wisdom." Now, in the other parable that we're going to look at, something similar is said. So we're already seeing a connection. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So two important pieces of information are given here, and one of them is a command, and that is to count the number of the beast. But before we can do that, we need to identify who this man is who has this same number. Now, the beast in this chapter is speaking of Rome, and specifically giving emphasis to its papal phase. Now, the beast in this chapter is speaking of Rome while giving emphasis to its papal phase. So let's see if this man is the Pope. If you look to the left on the screen, we see the Pope's crown. Looking to the left-hand side of the slide, we see the Pope's crown with a Latin inscription. Pardon my Latin. It says, Vicarius Filii Dei, which means substituting or in place of the Son of God. We've already learned that the papacy speaks great words, great blasphemies. What greater blasphemy could there be? Now, Latin is not only a system of letters, but it has numerical value too, and this adds up to 666. So this is a striking fulfillment of this prophecy. We know the beast is the papacy, and it's the number of the man. That man should be the Pope, and when we look at his number, when we look at his crown, this is what it says. It says 666, and it says Antichrist on it. But we still are left to do one last thing, and that is to count the number of the beast. We've identified that it is the number of a man, but we're still to count the number of the beast, and we'll learn how to do that in just a moment. Just wanted to compare two scriptures together, going to another prophecy found in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. It says, "In this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." And then just compare that back to Revelation 13:18 when we're looking at a prophecy concerning the papacy, and it's the number of a man. Well, which man could this possibly be? The Pope. Okay, so in order to understand how to count the number of the beast, we need to understand a bit of history. Starting with the center image, we have this dream of Nebuchadnezzar. It's the rise and fall of kingdoms from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece and then to Rome. What this statue represents is when these various nations would rule over God's people. It wasn't until 158 BC that Greek supremacy ended over the Jews. We're going to start with a prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, verse 23 to prove this point. "And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully." That he is speaking of Rome. So after the league is made with the Jews, the Romans shall work deceitfully. For he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. And Rome started off as a small nation. Now, comparing that with 1 Maccabees chapter 8, we have in this chapter the written account of the league. Starting with verse 1, Now Judas had heard of the Romans, that they were mighty and valiant men, and such as would lovingly accept all that join themselves unto them, and make a league of amity with all that came unto them. Jumping down to verse 28, Neither shall victuals be given to them that take part against them, or weapons, or money, or ships, as it hath seemed good to the Romans. But they shall keep their covenants, and that without deceit. So this is truly amazing. In the book of Daniel, years before this league was ever formed, we see that a league would be made and that they would work deceitfully. And then in the same language as recorded, we see that they did form a league and that the Romans themselves promised in their own words that they would work without deceit. And so this is a great hypocrisy. Now let's move over to the far side of the slide. On the right-hand side, we see that Rome comes up out of one of them, as recorded in Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. The he-goat represents Greece. There was a notable horn, Alexander. His empire was broken 4 ways, north, east, west, and south. And Rome comes up out of the west when they conquer Macedonia and they enter into the prophecy. So they come up again out of the west, and that was in 168 BC. But at this time, the Greeks were still subjugating God's people. So we're not in the phase of iron yet. In 161 BC, 7 years later, Daniel 11:23 is fulfilled. If you trace that arrow across the screen, if you follow the arrow across the screen, you can see Daniel 11:23 is pointing to 161 BC, as found in the image on the right. The second image on the far right is dealing with the little horn. From the prophecy, we learn that it would conquer the east, which was Syria, in 65 BC. It would conquer the pleasant land, that's Judea, in 63 BC. And it would end up conquering the rest of Alexander's empire with Egypt in 30 BC. But let's look at what happens in 158 BC when the Greek supremacy ceases. We're going to look at 1 Maccabees chapter 9. Quote, Whereof, when Jonathan had knowledge, he sent ambassadors unto him, to the end he should make peace with him, and deliver them the prisoners. Which thing he accepted, the he being Bacchus, the Greek general, and did according to his demands, and swear unto him that he would never do him harm all the days of his life. So this is the history that ends Greek supremacy. You'll notice that this is written in 1 Maccabees chapter 9. Historians maintain that this is 158 BC, and historians maintain that the chapter before, when the league was formed, was 161 BC. So now we're going to count the number of the beast. Remember that the beast is Rome. And we are going to date when we start counting the beast, when the legs of iron, as represented in the statue, take place. Greek supremacy is ended. They are no longer under the yoke of the Greeks. And now they're left to the Romans who have promised that they would work without deceit. But the prophecy says that they would work deceitfully. From 158 BC, the Jews are in jeopardy because Rome is going to begin to persecute them at some point. So we'll start counting from this date when that can happen. If you go 666 years into the future, it takes you to the taking away of the first phase of Rome. There are no more pagan kings. There's no more pagan emperors in the kingdom of Rome at this time. and we learned that in our previous episode. Okay, next we have two pictures, one of the historian Livy and the other on the right of Osiander, a Protestant Lutheran reformer. Now, Livy and Tacitus named the first forms of Roman government kings, consuls, dictators, and decemvirs. Interestingly, this Lutheran reformer, Osiander, establishes the 7 heads of Rome as kings, consuls, decemvirs, dictators, triumvirs, emperors, and popes. Let's look at our other parable found in the Revelation. Revelation 9. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. Same formula as we saw in the other parable. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Now, in Bible prophecy, mountains represent kingdoms, heads represent dominions. Now, in Bible prophecy, heads represent dominions and kingdoms, and mountains represent the same thing. They're interchangeable. And a woman represents an apostate church. So we have some sort of ecclesiastical power ruling over Rome. If you look on the right-hand side of the slide, we see that all of these various chapters in Revelation, 17 being the first one with the dragon, that was Revelation 12, and then we have Revelation 13. All these beasts here that you see represent the Roman kingdom, and it's the 7 heads. That's a strong indicator that that's who this is. With the dragon in Revelation 12, the second picture, emphasis is being given to the pagan phase. That's why it's represented as a dragon. But the emphasis in the other 2 pictures is to the papacy. So continuing on in our parable, verse 10, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Now, these kings are various phases of Roman government, and 5 are fallen in John's day, and 1 is ruling, and the other is yet to come, and that was the one that was future, that was the papacy. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7th, and goeth into perdition. So the 7th and 8th head are the same form of government. The 7th was the last phase of Roman government, which is the papacy. And in the prophecy of Revelation 13, we learn that Rome would suffer a deadly wound, but it would heal. So we just see the prophecy restated in another way, and this really establishes it. So the purpose of sharing these 2 parables with you is to show that they're really 2 sides of the same coin. By counting the number of the beast, we see that there's 2 phases in Roman history. We see a pagan phase and we see a papal phase. And when we understand that the 7 heads are 7 phases of Roman government, gluing chapters 17, 12, and 13 together, the same entity is being spoken of. We see that in 2 of the 3, emphasis is given to the papal phase, and in Revelation 12, the emphasis is given to the pagan phase. So in conclusion, we learn that all of these beasts, all of these figures are symbolic of Rome, and that's the important thing that God wants us to take away. Now we're going to move on to this secret time prophecy. We're going to read a commentary in Revelation chapter 10, verse 6. Keep in mind that the Old Testament prophets greatly desired to look into the things that we are studying. Quote, "This time, when the angel declares with a solemn oath, is not the end of this world's history, neither of probationary time, but of prophetic time, which should precede the advent of our Lord." So just to jog your memory a little bit, this is speaking of Revelation chapter 10, and the little book is finally unsealed at this point. So we are in post 1798, and this angel is none less than the personage of Jesus Christ. And he's going to give us the interpretation. He's going to share the contents of the little book. And he tells us that time should be no longer. But this can't be talking about world history, because at the end of the chapter, after this message has gone to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, the injunction is given to prophesy again. So it must be the end of the prophetic periods, which would terminate slightly before the coming of the Lord. Continuing in the quote, that is, the people will not have another message upon definite time. After this period of time, reaching from 1842 to 1844, there can be no definite tracing of prophetic time. The longest reckoning reaches to the autumn of 1844. We learn that the longest reckoning reaches to the autumn of 1844. But also we see that there was definite tracing down to the year 1842. There's prophetic time reaching from 1842 to 1844. The longest reckoning goes to 1844, but what is ending in 1842? 1842 would not have been mentioned unless there was a prophetic period that ended there, and the Adventists were preaching that there was a prophetic period that ended there. Now, we aren't going to look deeply into this prophetic period, but I just wanted to spark your interest. There is another prophetic period besides the 666 years, besides the counting of the number of the beast, that begins in 158 BC, and this is known as the 2,000 years of Hosea. There's 2 days, they're prophetic days, and days here aren't representing years. And the reason that we know this is because in Luke chapter 13, Christ is speaking of the same thing. These 2 days couldn't be literal days. We can't apply day for a year principle. It doesn't work. It's definitely not an indefinite amount of time. So we're only left with one other interpretation as given in the Bible, and that is a day represents 1,000 years. And from 2,000 years from 158 BC, it takes you to 1842. And then there's a third day, which the Millerites thought would begin in 1843. And that third day is the millennium. Moving on to our next point, I really believe you'll like learning about this in particular. This is the 6,000 years prophecy. Starting with a quote from the great historian Gibbon. Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, speaking of the faith and character of the primitive Christians, says, quote, the ancient and popular doctrine of the millennium was intimately connected with the second coming of Christ. So this is an ancient doctrine, it's a popular doctrine, this is an apostolic doctrine. And it's intimately connected with the second coming of Christ, so it has great import. Continuing in the quote, as the works of creation had been finished in 6 days, their duration in a present state, according to a tradition which was attributed to the prophet Elijah, was fixed at 6,000 years. So the 6 days of creation are shadows. They're typical of how long Earth's history would be approximately. And then in Revelation, we learn about 1,000 years where the earth would be at rest. And in the 7th day of creation, where God sanctifies the Sabbath, we see that the 4th commandment is a shadow of this great millennium. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have a pretty impressive list of great men, and these are men that believed in the 6,000 years. We're going to read 2 quotes now. And from these 2 quotes, we're going to be able to conclude that this doctrine of the 6,000 years was of great significance to the Adventists. Starting with Josiah Litch. It appears to me that this argument in favor of the nearness of the great Sabbath will have its influence where no other will. For there are few persons who believe the Bible who will attempt to put the millennium beyond the 6,000 year of the world. I invite the most rigid criticism on the above outline. He was asking people to take a look at his chronology. Can you find any fault with it? Now, Miller, who had his chronology as well, says this: surely all must agree that the weight of testimony is in favor of that chronology which makes the year of Christ's birth, according to our computation, 4,157 years after the creation or fall of man. Then by adding 843 years, we have our 6,000 years up to the commencing of the day of rest, or the beginning of the 7,000th year, or the great Sabbath, or which our seventh day is but a shadow. What strong evidence is this, that we are now living at the end of the 6,000 years, in which the work of redemption must be completed, and the glory of God be revealed in the face of Jesus Christ at his appearing and his kingdom. The man on the screen is Usher. Usher has a famous chronology. I believe it's the most popular in Christendom, and for good reason. We're going to compare Usher's chronology with Miller's chronology. It's important to understand that chronologers are in agreement, more or less, when dealing with the various dispensations found in the Bible. In chronology, they partition certain portions of the Bible. For instance, from Adam down to the flood forms one portion of chronology. Chronologers generally date that to be 1,656 years. There's a reason that there's great unanimity on this point. The Bible record is just very clear. Adam lived this many years. Seth lived this many years. And Noah lived this many years. So all you have to do is apply some basic arithmetic, and you'll find out that there's 1,656 years from Adam down to the flood. But something interesting happens when we get to the time span of the judges. There's a disconnect. So why do you suppose that the chronologers are not all in perfect agreement